For 28 years, my parents convinced everyone I was incapable of surviving the real world. So it was pretty awkward when I slid a $3.2 million check across their table to save them from ruin. My name is Maya, and I was always the family tragedy. I wasn't stupid, but my parents would put on this mask of deep sorrow and whisper that I was just a little bit slow. They needed that narrative to contrast their golden child, my older brother, Harrison. He was the genius who was gonna change the world. Making me, the helpless daughter, let them play the patient martyrs. This psychological warfare was so constant, I actually believed them. If I struggled with math, my mom wouldn't get a tutor. She'd just sigh, take my pencil, and say my brain didn't work that way. If I wanted to go to a good college, my dad would pat my shoulder and suggest local programs for a slower pace. They dismantled my confidence until I was totally convinced I was defective. It wasn't until I moved out and started therapy that the fog lifted. I realized my mind was perfectly fine. Actually, it was razor sharp. I had a crazy good memory and a ruthless capacity for organization. But I didn't tell my family that. I let them think I was barely scraping by, working odd jobs and struggling to be an adult. I kept my distance and let them play their roles. What they didn't know was that I built a highly successful, intensely discreet business. I'm an estate liquidator for the ultra-wealthy. When a prominent family goes bankrupt, the banks call me. My team untangles the financial messes and quietly liquidates the assets before the public finds out. I walk through the sprawling mansions of people who pretended to be rich until the bank locked the doors. I know exactly what it looks like when a wealthy family is secretly drowning. I know the smell of quiet desperation. And my parents were about to find out how good I am at my job. My parents lived in Hawthorne Manor up in New York. It had been in my dad's family for generations, and it was basically their entire identity. To them, keeping up that rich image was a religion. They were always hosting these lavish summer galas and catered holidays. They loved parading their supposed wealth in front of all the aunts, uncles, and cousins. That house was their ultimate proof that they were just better than everyone else. The whole thing kicked off right before the annual Labor Day gathering. I hadn't been back in 3 years because the vibe was just toxic. But my mom called me 6 times in 1 week, laying on this super urgent guilt trip. She said Harrison was making some massive announcement about his tech startup and everybody had to be there. Then she threw in that they were worried about how I was feeding myself. I ended up going mostly just out of morbid curiosity. Driving up that long gravel driveway was usually a total masterclass in intimidation. But this time, my professional instincts flared up the second I passed the front gates. The heavy ironwork was literally rusting at the hinges. The gravel hadn't been turned, and those massive bushes were overgrown and rotting at the roots. To a normal person, it just looked like nature taking over. But to an estate liquidator, it was a massive red flag. Stepping inside, that uneasy feeling just got worse. The house was spotless, but it felt completely hollow. My aunts and uncles greeted me with those same old pitying smiles, talking to me like I was a toddler. Right on cue, my mom swooped in, kissing my cheek while fixing my collar to make me look presentable. She launched straight into her usual performance. It was humiliating, sure, but this time her voice had this frantic, desperate edge to it. Within 5 minutes, she was loudly asking Uncle David if he knew of any entry-level data entry jobs for me. She was totally projecting. She was shining this massive spotlight on my supposed failures just to distract everyone from whatever was really going on. dinner was where the real revelation happened. We were all sitting at this massive antique mahogany table. I just sat quietly at the end while Harrison held court, throwing around tech buzzwords like synergy and blockchain to sound important. He sounded so impressive to the older relatives, but to anyone who actually understood business, he was spouting absolute nonsense. He was just a charismatic fraud throwing around buzzwords. As I listened to him, I picked up my fork. I paused. The family silver was this massive set of sterling that always weighed heavy in your hand. But this fork was way too light. I turned it over under the table. No hallmark. It was high-quality silver plate. A complete replica. My heart started beating a little faster. I looked up and glanced at the mantel. The original oil painting that hung there for 40 years was gone. In its place was a remarkably good print on textured canvas. They were quietly cannibalizing the house from the inside out. The next morning, I woke up early before anyone else was stirring. I slipped into my father's library. This room used to be his absolute pride and joy. I ran my fingers along the spines of his rare first editions. The beautiful leather-bound copy of Moby Dick was gone, replaced by a cheap modern reprint. The signed Hemingway was missing entirely. I pulled out my phone and took photos of the empty spaces. I documented the fake silver and the replica painting. I see this every single week in my line of work. I knew exactly what I was looking at. I left the estate that afternoon, making a quiet excuse. My mother gave me a tight smile. She slipped a $20 bill into my coat pocket. Told me to buy myself a nice hot meal. I didn't say a word. I just got in my car and began the drive back to the city. My mind was racing. Their perfect illusion was finally crumbling. When I got to my office on Monday, I closed the door and went to work. I have access to forensic accountants and specialized databases. Stuff the general public doesn't even know exists. It was time to dig. I started pulling property records for Hawthorne Manor. I dug into the county tax records and the state corporate filings for my father's holding companies. I even pulled everything I could find on Harrison's tech startup. It took me 3 solid days to untangle their massive web of lies. When I finally mapped it all out on the whiteboard in my office, the sheer scale of their delusion took my breath away. Hawthorne Manor was completely drowning. My parents had taken out a second mortgage 5 years ago and a third one 2 years ago. The property taxes were 3 years delinquent, and the county had already issued multiple warnings. They had maxed out every single line of credit they had. They had quietly sold off every liquid asset of value. The family silver, the original art, the rare books. They auctioned it all off through private brokers just to keep the lights on and the facade intact. But the most sickening part was where all that money had actually gone. It hadn't gone to bad investments in the stock market or secret medical bills. Every last dime of it had gone straight to Harrison. Harrison's tech startup was a complete black hole. He had never actually produced a viable product. He just spent years renting expensive Manhattan office space, hosting lavish parties, and paying himself an exorbitant salary. When the real investors realized he was a fraud and pulled out, Harrison went crying to my parents. Totally terrified their golden child might be exposed as a failure, they decided to fund him themselves. They bled the family legacy dry to protect his fragile ego. And then I looked at the timeline. I stood there comparing the dates of the desperate loans and tax defaults to the dates of major family events. A cold, hard realization settled over me. 5 years ago, they took out the second mortgage. That same Thanksgiving, my mother gave a tearful speech to 20 relatives about my supposed lack of ambition. 2 years ago, they took out the third mortgage, and my dad told everyone I'd been fired. The timeline was absolute proof. Every time their financial reality crashed down, they escalated their public abuse of me. They used me as a human shield to distract the pack. I felt a profound, freezing anger settle into my bones. I wasn't done digging yet. I had to know exactly how deep the hole was. So I pulled up the county's public notices, and there it was, the final nail in the coffin. A notice of default and intent to foreclose. The bank was officially out of patience. They had 30 days to come up with $3.2 million. If they didn't, the manor was going straight to the auction block. I just sat there staring at it for a while. I could have just sat back and watched the whole thing burn down. But after 28 years of being their punching bag, no. I needed to look them in the eye when the glass shattered. 2 weeks later, my phone rings. It's my mother. I pick it up and her voice is shaking. But she's still laying on that thick, fake maternal concern she always uses. She tells me they need me to come over this weekend for a serious family meeting. She says Harrison's gonna be there, plus Aunt Carol and Uncle David for support. She claims they need to discuss my future. I knew exactly what they were doing. The bank was closing in and they were desperate for cash. They were gonna try to steal the trust fund my grandmother left me. So I put on my best timid voice and told her I'd be there. I spent the next 3 days getting ready for war. I didn't just print their financial records, I curated them. I was building a case so airtight and devastating, it made my corporate liquidations look like child's play. I loaded everything into this massive black leather binder. The hidden mortgages, the tax defaults, the auction receipts for the family silver. It was 28 years of lies, all bound up in one heavy book. Then I made one last stop at my bank. I had them draft a certified cashier's check for exactly $3.2 million. The exact amount it would take to clear their debt and buy the estate outright. I packed the binder and the check into my briefcase and locked it. I straightened my suit, took one last look in the mirror, and took a deep breath. It was finally time to go home. I pulled up to the manor that Saturday afternoon. The crunch of the dying gravel under my tires was the only sound. The rusting gates and overgrown bushes looked even more pathetic now that I knew the truth. I parked, took a deep breath, and grabbed my briefcase. The vibe inside the formal living room was suffocatingly tense when I walked in. My parents were perched on the dark velvet sofas, looking like royalty awaiting a peasant. Harrison was pacing nervously by the fireplace, trying way too hard to look like he was in charge. Before I could even settle in, my mother rushed right over to me. She grabbed my arm with this theatrical, fake maternal concern. She was treating me like some fragile patient who might just shatter at any second. She loudly whispered that they were going to take things very slowly for me. I didn't say a single word to her. I just walked over to the chair opposite them and sat down, putting my briefcase squarely on my lap. I kept my posture perfectly straight and just stared at her. I let the silence stretch out until it got really uncomfortable. My dad finally broke the silence, clearing his throat and putting on his best tragic patriarch voice. He started going on about how they'd always worried about my ability to handle the real world. He claimed they'd noticed a severe decline in me lately, and that they were terrified for my future. Right on cue, Harrison chimed in from his spot by the fireplace. He crossed his arms defensively, puffing out his chest in his expensive fleece vest. He told me they just wanted to protect me. He actually said the world was a tough place and I just wasn't equipped to handle it. I didn't give them the soft, timid reaction they were expecting. I looked right at Harrison, my voice completely steady and razor sharp. I asked him exactly what it was they were trying to protect me from. The sudden authority in my tone made the whole room freeze. My mother let out a heavy sigh and started dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. She told me they'd spoken to a lawyer and thought it was best to establish a conservatorship over me. They wanted me to voluntarily sign away my grandmother's trust fund so they could manage it. I looked down at the legal documents sitting innocently on the glass coffee table between us. They were literally trying to steal my future to pay for Harrison's past mistakes. They were so desperate to hide their bankruptcy that they were willing to legally destroy my autonomy. I looked back up at my parents, asking if they truly believed I was financially illiterate and a danger to myself. When my dad nodded and said I needed them to save me, I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of an executioner right before the blade drops. I unlatched my briefcase. The click echoed in the quiet room. I pulled out my heavy black binder, and I dropped it right on top of their conservatorship papers. The thud made my mother flinch. I leaned back in my chair and looked at my dad. I told him that if I'm so financially illiterate, I'm having a really hard time understanding these documents. I said maybe Harrison, the business genius, could explain them to me. Harrison frowned, staring at the binder. He tried to keep up his arrogant act. He told me this wasn't the time for my games. Open it, I commanded. My voice cracked like a whip. It wasn't the timid voice they were used to. The sudden authority in my tone shocked the room into absolute silence. Harrison hesitantly opened the binder. The first page was the bank's notice of default. It had a glaring red county clerk stamp. All the color instantly drained from his face. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "What is this?" Harrison whispered. I kept my eyes locked on my dad. I told him it was the foreclosure notice on Hawthorne Manor. They were $3.2 million in debt. The property would be auctioned off in exactly 14 days. My dad's jaw dropped. He tried to speak, but only a choked sound came out. His entire authoritative persona just dissolved. My mom let out a terrified gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth in genuine shock. My dad stammered, begging to explain. I cut him off instantly. My voice was cold and relentless. I told him he didn't need to explain because I already did the math. Then I ordered Harrison to turn the page. Moving like a robot, Harrison turned the page. I explained that these were the 3 separate mortgages they took out over the last 5 years. I laid out exactly how they leveraged a historic, paid-off estate to the absolute brink. I told Harrison to turn the page again. I revealed the auction receipts. I told everyone how they secretly sold off the family silver and original artwork, and how they replaced it all with cheap replicas to keep up appearances. And finally, I told him to turn to the last section. Harrison didn't even want to touch the page. His hands were shaking so violently, I actually had to reach over and flip it for him. It was a complete forensic breakdown of his precious tech startup. I laid it all out for the room. His company hadn't made a single dime in 6 years. He was entirely funded by the equity of our parents' house. My parents bled their legacy dry just to fund the illusion that Harrison was a success. But the best part? Every time they took out a desperate new loan to cover his failures, they hosted a family event just to publicly mock me. They called me stupid to distract everyone from the fact that they were losing everything. The silence in that room was absolute. It was the sound of a 28-year-old lie shattering into a million pieces. My mother was openly weeping into her hands. My father looked like he had aged 20 years in 5 minutes, completely broken. Then Uncle David stood up, his face red with fury. He looked at my father with utter disgust and asked if it was true. Were they really going to steal my trust fund to hide their own bankruptcy? My father couldn't even answer. He just squeezed his eyes shut. I answered for him. I told David that yes, it was all true. They invited the extended family here today to witness them legally rob me. They honestly thought I was too stupid to realize what was happening. With the room still reeling, I reached into my briefcase one last time. I pulled out the crisp blue cashier's check. I placed it on the glass table right next to the binder. It was the final nail in the coffin. My father opened his eyes and stared at the check. He blinked, completely unable to comprehend the string of numbers printed on it. He whispered, asking what it was. He looked like a man who had just forgotten his own name. I told him it was a cashier's check for $3.2 million, drawn directly from one of my corporate accounts. I explained that I run a premium estate liquidation firm. I handle the bankruptcies of the ultra-wealthy. Let that sink in for a second. I told them I am incredibly good at my job, and I am incredibly wealthy. I could buy Hawthorne Manor 5 times over and not even feel it. The look on their faces was absolutely priceless. My mother looked up, her tear-streaked face contorted in shock. Through her confusion, a sickening glimmer of hope appeared. She actually thought I was stepping in to rescue them. She asked if I was going to save the house. The sheer audacity of her delusion almost made me laugh. She still thought I was the obedient, desperate daughter seeking her approval. I looked her dead in the eye and called her by her first name. I told her I wasn't saving the house for her. I explained that the check wasn't a gift. It was a purchase agreement. I slid a single sheet of paper across the glass table. It was a legally binding contract of sale. I told them I was buying Hawthorne Manor outright. The bank had already agreed to my terms. I was paying off their massive debt in exchange for the deed. But they weren't keeping the house, and they certainly weren't staying. That's when Harrison finally snapped. His panic broke through his arrogant facade and he started yelling. He screamed that I couldn't just kick them out into the street. He was terrified of losing his safety net. I stood up, buttoning my jacket, and looked down at my older brother. The golden child. The absolute fraud. I told him I was sure a genius tech CEO like himself could easily afford to buy them a condo. I reminded him that they gave him $3 million, so it was his turn to provide. Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish. No words came out. He had absolutely nothing. I looked at my parents one last time. They were sitting in the absolute ruins of their own ego. The facade was completely done. The extended family now knew exactly who they were and what they had done. I told them they had 30 days to pack whatever they hadn't already pawned. The check and the contract were on the table. They had until Monday morning to sign the deed over to me. And I told them I never wanted to hear them call me stupid again. I picked up my empty briefcase and turned away. Aunt Carol and Uncle David parted to let me through, looking at me with pure shock and awe. I didn't look back. I just walked out the front door and left them in their mess. Monday morning rolled around and they signed the papers. They sat in a sterile office, completely defeated, signing away the deed. They had absolutely no other choice. True to my word, 30 days later, I took possession of Hawthorne Manor. I stood at the end of that long driveway, looking up at the estate. It was finally mine, but on my own terms. My parents and Harrison had to pack whatever they hadn't already pawned. They moved into a cramped, dingy two-bedroom apartment in the next town over. Say, harsh truth? It was a brutal reality check after decades of faking it. The fallout with the extended family was immediate. Aunt Carol, Uncle David, and everyone else completely cut them off. They were totally disgusted by the deception and the cruelty they'd put me through. Without my parents bleeding their legacy dry to fund him, Harrison's fake company folded. It only took 2 months for the golden child to hit rock bottom. He was forced to take a job managing a cheap cell phone kiosk at the mall. As for the manor, I didn't keep it. It was a monument to their ego, not a home. I brought in my liquidation team and we got straight to work. We spent 3 grueling weeks tearing through the estate. My team cataloged every single item of value that was left. We prepped the entire property for a massive commercial sale. Once the house was stripped bare, I took one last walk through the halls. The heavy, suffocating vibe was completely gone. Listening to the echo of my footsteps, I felt nothing but peace. For 28 years, they told everyone I was too stupid to succeed. But there I was, standing in the empty grand foyer, signing the final paperwork to sell their precious estate for a massive profit. I finally realized the ultimate truth. I wasn't the slow one, and I was never broken. I was just taking my time, waiting for the perfect moment to prove them wrong. The Hawthorne sale didn't just close a chapter. It skyrocketed my firm into a whole new league. Word gets around fast when you dismantle a historic estate. Suddenly, my phone was ringing off the hook. I was looking at a new portfolio that made Hawthorne Manor look like a tiny starter home. Tracing the red lines on my whiteboard, I felt that familiar thrill. The brain my parents called slow was now dissecting the ruin of actual billionaires. Meanwhile, reality was hitting my mom in the most brutal ways. Evelyn was now wandering the fluorescent aisles of a discount grocery store. She still wore those pale peach designer dresses, terrified an old country club friend might spot her. My dad's fall from grace was a lot quieter. He spent his afternoons sitting on a weathered bench near their cramped apartment. He'd wear his wrinkled navy blazer, pretending to read the Financial Times. That tragic patriarch act was totally useless now. And then there was Harrison, the golden boy who was going to change the world. His reality check came with a brightly lit mall kiosk. I actually drove past once and saw him getting chewed out by a teenage manager over cheap phone cases. I didn't spend much time dwelling on their misery. I was way too busy building my own empire. I took the massive profits from the Hawthorne sale and locked them into ironclad trusts. Hearing that heavy bank vault close felt like pure freedom. Walking through the busy streets of Manhattan, I felt this crazy physical lightness. The crushing weight of my family's mind games had just evaporated. I wasn't the defective daughter anymore. I was the woman who outsmarted everyone who tried to bury her. I even started quietly mentoring young women who came from super toxic families. I taught them how to untangle their money and build secret safety nets. Mostly, I taught them how to trust their own minds. It was my way of saving the younger me. Back in my office, I put that heavy black master binder right on the top shelf. It just sat there like a trophy, a leather-bound reminder of the exact day I took my power back. I didn't even need to open it anymore.
I stood by my office window as the sun set over the city.
The shift from the suffocating shadows of Hawthorne Manor to this limitless horizon was complete. They spent decades calling me a tragedy. The real tragedy was they never knew who they were dealing with. My firm didn't just grow after that. It evolved into an absolute institution. I started hiring people who were wired exactly like me. Sharp, observant, and totally unimpressed by fake wealth. We turned dismantling broken dynasties into an exact science. I still personally oversee the biggest liquidations. When I hold a genuine piece of antique silver now, I don't just feel the weight. I feel the actual truth of it. There are no cheap replicas in my world anymore. Only cold, hard authenticity. The contrast couldn't be sharper these days. Evelyn spends her afternoons in a cramped linoleum kitchen. She tries to keep her dignity while washing cheap, mismatched plates. The grand dining room she used to rule is just a ghost now, and it haunts every inch of that tiny apartment. My dad's tragic patriarch routine finally hit a wall. He sits at a wobbly little table, staring at utility bills he can barely pay. The heavy burden he used to fake for sympathy? Yeah, it's entirely real now. And you can see how it's completely broken him. Harrison's grand delusions of being a tech visionary are totally gone, replaced by the harsh reality of retail hours and minimum wage. He stands under those sterile mall lights, pitching phone chargers to kids who just ignore him. The golden child finally had to learn what actual work looks like. I wiped that Hawthorne Manor web off my whiteboard a long time ago. Now, the board is filled with new puzzles and new empires to untangle. Every clean line I draw is a testament to my own mind. The exact same mind they tried so hard to convince me was broken. I spend my weekends a lot differently these days. Instead of dreading toxic family dinners, I walk through high-end art galleries. I get to appreciate art that isn't being secretly pawned off to cover a lie. I surround myself with beauty that's actually stable and secure. Sometimes I catch my reflection and think about that terrified younger version of me, the girl who used to sit silently at the end of that mahogany table. I really wish I could tell her she was never the problem. The armor I wear now was forged right in the fire of their deception. I don't carry that master binder with me anymore. Its job is completely done. Now, my briefcase just holds the future. Contracts, acquisitions, and the power to dictate my own terms. In a world that respects nothing but leverage and pure intelligence. They wanted a family tragedy, but I gave them an empire instead. Every time I step out into the city, I know I earned every single piece of my life. I'm Maya, the woman who bought her own freedom, and I am exactly where I belong. 30 days later, I officially took the keys to Hawthorne Manor. And I didn't show up alone. I brought my entire liquidation team to rip apart the physical evidence of my family's 28-year lie. We spent 3 solid weeks tearing through that estate, room by room. My team cataloged every single item. We had to separate the few actual antiques left from the absolute sea of cheap replicas my parents bought to keep up their little facade. I stood there and watched them take down the fake canvas print from above the stone fireplace. Seeing that blank space on the dark wallpaper felt amazing. It was like the house was finally exhaling after holding its breath for decades. Then we hit my dad's prized library. We boxed up all those cheap vintage reprints he tried to pass off as rare first editions. Stripping that room of its fake prestige felt like finally telling the truth out loud. They even took apart the massive mahogany dining table.
That was the exact spot where Harrison used to spin his ridiculous tech bro fairy tales. Watching it get loaded into a moving truck was like watching the center of their toxic universe get dismantled. Once the furniture was gone, the whole vibe of the house shifted. That suffocating, heavy feeling completely vanished. It was just bare floors and empty walls that couldn't hide any more secrets. I walked through the empty halls, just listening to the echo of my own footsteps. For the first time in my life, being in this house didn't make me anxious. I felt absolutely nothing but peace. We weren't just emptying the place out, though. We were prepping the land for a massive commercial sale. I had contractors out front ripping up those dead bushes and tearing down the rusted gates to make way for new development. For 28 years, my parents dedicated their lives to convincing everyone I was too stupid to succeed. They built an entire religion around their own superiority. They used my supposed failures as the foundation for their incredibly fragile egos. But as I stood in that empty foyer, signing the final paperwork to sell their precious estate for a massive profit, I realized the ultimate truth. I wasn't the slow one. I was just taking my time, waiting for the perfect moment to prove them wrong. I drove away from Hawthorne Manor for the last time. The rusting gates and dying bushes were already gone. I didn't even bother checking the rearview mirror. That toxic chapter of my life was permanently closed. While I was closing deals, my parents were facing reality. They had to move into a cramped, dingy apartment. It was in a neighboring town, far from their country club. The crushing weight of being broke finally caught up to them. My mother tried so hard to keep up her old money illusion. She'd sit in her tiny kitchen wearing lavish pastel dresses. But without the manor as her backdrop, the magic was gone. She just looked like a tired woman playing dress-up. My father's transformation was honestly even worse. So, if you strip away the illusion, that tragic, authoritative patriarch routine completely vanished. He was just a broken old man staring blankly at a TV. He was totally stripped of the respect he used to demand. They tried reaching out to the extended family, of course, hoping to spin some new victim narrative. But Aunt Carol and Uncle David completely cut them off. Every single phone call went straight to voicemail. As for my brother, his downfall was swift and absolute. 2 months later, his fake tech company officially folded. He had to pack up his rented Manhattan office in disgrace. That arrogant smirk of his was permanently erased. Stripped of his buzzwords, Harrison had to face the real world. He ended up taking a job at a suburban mall, managing a brightly lit cell phone kiosk. The supposed genius CEO was now pushing screen protectors. Back in my world, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. I stood in my sleek, ultra-modern office, updating my whiteboard with the final profit numbers. The messy webs of their debt were totally erased, replaced by the clean, undeniable math of my success. My liquidation team gathered around my glass desk. We reviewed the final portfolio, and the respect was mutual. There were no pitying smiles or condescending pats here. I was the undisputed head of a highly lucrative firm. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. 28 years of psychological warfare had failed to break me. I had built an absolute empire in the shadows, and now I was finally stepping into the light. For 28 years, my parents pushed the narrative that I was too simple to make it. They convinced everyone I was a fragile tragedy. But looking at their empty lives now, you realize how exhausting that lie was. They were the fragile ones all along. Before handing the keys to the new buyers, I took one last walk through the manor. My team had completely cleared the place out. The grand foyer used to be the main stage for my mom's performances. Now, it's just a big, echoing room. I just listened to the click of my shoes echoing off the bare floors. Growing up, walking these halls gave me suffocating anxiety. But now, breathing in the dusty air of this empty house, I just felt total peace. The ghosts were finally gone. I set up a cheap plastic folding table right in the middle of the foyer. It was kind of hilarious finalizing the massive sale of their precious ancestral home on a $20 piece of plastic. No audience, no fake tears, just a done deal. I picked up my pen and signed the final transfer of deed, officially selling the estate for a huge profit. With every signature, I was erasing the last physical trace of their toxic legacy. I don't need their approval anymore. I gathered up the signed papers, slid them into my briefcase, and snapped the locks shut. That sharp little click echoed through the empty house, and that was it. The absolute end of the Hawthorne family charade. It was finally time to go home. I stepped out the front doors, pulled them shut, and turned the key. The massive stone mansion just stood there, totally silent. It wasn't a monument to my parents' ego anymore, just another liquidated asset. I walked away, leaving those shadows behind for good. The drive back to the city was so quiet. I thought about that little girl who used to sit at the dining table, terrified to speak because she thought she was broken. I wish I could tell her she was actually the smartest person in the room. The next morning, I was right back at my desk. The phone rang with a new client, another wealthy family quietly drowning in debt, needing my help. I opened a fresh folder, already organizing the chaos. The work never stops, and I'm exactly where I belong. As I looked over the new case files, I couldn't help but smile. For 28 years, I let them believe I was the slow one. But sitting in the empire I built from scratch, I realized the truth. I was just taking my time, waiting for the perfect moment.